Hi, welcome to this Macroeconomics Masterclass. My name is Iryna McDonald, and I'm going to be your tutor for this session. So this session will cover the following two topics. We need to understand initially what are the components that make up the economy and how the economy operates. And then we're also going to look at the actions available to the government to influence the economy. We know that government would like every economy to grow. So what are the possible things that government can do to increase the size of the economy? So let's focus on this for a moment and introduce us to the key issues in regulating the economy. So when government is regulating the economy, there are four key macroeconomic policy objectives, four things we want to achieve for a healthy economy. Firstly and foremost, we want economic growth. We want more goods to be demanded and produced because that makes everybody better off. As an individual, when the economy is growing, there are more things you could afford, more things you can buy. Also, growing economy creates jobs, and therefore low unemployment will mean that everybody can participate in the labor force, and therefore the economy will have greater skills they could use. Low inflation talks about the importance of stability of prices, because if our prices are predictable, you know how much things are going to cost tomorrow, then it's easier to plan. And finally, we're also going to think about how international money transfers influence our economy. So balance of payments, we'll look at inflows and outflows of money from the economy to understand the impact it will have on the size of the economy as well as our currency. So let's now consider those issues one by one. Firstly, let's think about economic growth. So the definition of the economic growth is that more goods are demanded and produced. As in individuals, consumers are purchasing more, companies are investing in the economy to make more of those goods and services. And generally, as we know, economic growth is the good thing because it creates employment opportunities. There are more jobs because companies are looking for labor to work in their factories. And those individuals, because they are now in demand, everybody wants to employ them, could achieve higher earnings. And that leads to better standard of living. We can all enjoy our life a bit more. However, we need to be mindful that economic growth also has its negative consequences. So among those negative consequences, we need to think about natural resources. If we grow in a way that depletes our rainforests, that could create long-term issues for the planet. So we need to think about a sustainable approach to growth in a way that does not contribute to, let's say, climate change. We also need to be mindful of the fact that though the economy could be growing, it's not growing for everybody. The growth in the economy could also lead to inequality. Sometimes the wealthier part of the population could be benefiting from growth, they're receiving greater returns on their investment, whereas people at the bottom may not be actually able to find jobs, may not be able to earn enough to sustain themselves. Finally, we're also going to link economic growth with inflation, because when the economy is growing and everybody wants to buy more, that may lead to the increase in prices that could lead to inflation that makes goods less affordable to those on limited income. Let's move on and have a look at unemployment. So the definition of the unemployment is that people are looking for jobs but are not able to find them. So if you're actively seeking that job, but there is nothing on offer, then you'd be considered unemployed. And as we said, we want to keep unemployment fairly low because unemployed do lose skills over time. If you think back to the time you were in school and maybe you learned a foreign language or musical instrument, but you haven't used that language for a while, or you haven't played this instrument, you'll probably know it's going to be hard to come back to it. The same with any other skill, including employment skills. If you are not part of a labor force for a while, you start to forget those skills necessary for employment. When people are unemployed, that often diminishes their income, and that could lead to poor lifestyle choices, to family breakdown. So those people that are unemployed may feel down about themselves. From the government perspective, they will have to spend more on benefits to support those that are unemployed, and therefore government will have less cash to spend on healthcare, on education, on transport. That reduces the benefits available to the rest of the society. So why could possibly unemployment arise? First type of unemployment is cyclical. Later on, we're going to talk about the natural cycle fluctuations through our economy. There could be times like recession, depression, when the economy is down, when the size of the economy is too small to accommodate all of those willing to find a job. And therefore, in the downturn, there will be unemployment. Frictional unemployment is about people being in between jobs, because sometimes we all need a little bit of a break. We take a few months off, reconsider our priorities before rejoining the labor force. So frictional unemployment is not normally seen as a problem because it addresses itself very quickly. Structural employment is more of an issue. It arises when the structure of economy is changing, when certain industries become no longer viable in the economy. So for example, if the economy was heavily focused on manufacturing, but the cost of manufacturing have become too high, the economy is restructuring towards the service sector, then employees who have skills in manufacturing may be structurally unemployed because they're simply no longer required in that labor force. Seasonal unemployment normally arises in jobs that are dependent on the seasons, times of the year. For example, in the tourism industry, summer normally leads to high employment because lots of tourists might be coming into a particular area, whereas in winter, there may be fewer tourists and therefore less employment in the tourism industry. Finally, real wage unemployment looks at the fact that sometimes wages set by the union could be a little too high for the employers to afford. So employers therefore react to those high wages by employing fewer staff than they otherwise would like to. So if wages negotiated with the union are too high, that reduces the number of people able to get the jobs at that high wage. Moving on to inflation. So definition of the inflation is sustained increase in price levels. As in, you could observe in real life that prices do tend to increase over time. So what might be an issue here? The first issue, if the prices increase very quickly, it creates uncertainty. It's very difficult for you as an individual to plan your purchases. It's going to be very difficult for companies to predict how much raw materials will cost them in the future, and therefore what profits they might make by selling goods made out of those raw materials. High inflation stifles investment. When companies are facing a lot of uncertainty, they're less willing to invest. Inflation also discourages savings. If you put your money in the current account in the bank and only earn, let's say 1%, whereas inflation is 5%, actually the purchasing power of your money depletes over time. So people have a disincentive to save, disincentive to provide for themselves in the future for the rainy day, and therefore they might end up in more difficult lifetime circumstances. Finally, people need to think about their income sources. If you're poor with limited income, inflation could make it even harder for you to obtain those basics that are becoming more expensive. Or if your income is fixed, for example, you're a pensioner and you receive the same amount every month as your pension, as prices rise, that fixed amount you're receiving in your pension can buy you fewer and fewer things that you need. So why does the inflation happen? The first cause of inflation is demand pull. That means we're all interested in the same thing. A good example here would be to consider the issue of diamonds. We all know that diamonds are expensive, but why are they expensive? Why are we paying such a fortune for them? They're sparkly, they're often used in jewelry, but because everybody believes that diamonds are cool and desirable, we all want to buy them, and that allows the diamond mining companies to keep those prices fairly high. There is another reason why our inflation could be high. Let's think about costs. You might observe that in present circumstances, the cost of energy, whether it is fuel, whether it's electricity, whether it's gas, are going up significantly. And because those are the basic resources that every organization needs to operate, as the cost to your organization go up, in order to preserve its profit margins, organization will be forced to increase its prices. Expectations effect talks about our combined decision making and therefore actions that could arise from it. So let's now ask you, what do you think the inflation is going to be next year? If you think the inflation is going to be high, let's think about your action plan. High inflation means things will be more expensive in the future. So therefore, it might be more worthwhile to purchase them now. And if you and I and everybody else starts buying now, we're going to create a shortage, a deficit of items. And therefore, those prices for the items will go up. However, what if we decide that, you know what, prices are going to fall next year? So we are going to postpone our purchases. We're going to wait and see. And if you don't buy and I don't buy and nobody else buys, manufacturers will have no choice but to drop those prices to get rid of stock. So the inflation will also be low. So our combined actions make a difference. If we expect certain things to happen, through our combined actions, we could reinforce that particular trend. Moving on to imported inflation. If you live in a country in the economy that heavily depends on imports, when the prices of those imported goods go up, the prices in the country will have to go up to help companies to maintain their profit margins. Final type of inflation is monetary inflation. That talks about expansion in the money supply, just more money going around. So let's imagine, what if the government was to print a nice new shiny £1 million note and give it to every person in UK? On one hand, you go, wow, everybody's now a millionaire. But on the other hand, think about what's going to happen the day after. So think about basics like your price of coffee, because everybody now is flush with cash. Everybody has millions to spend. Coffee, instead of a few quid, might be costing you £100 because everybody is able to throw cash around. So we have to be very careful about availability of cash in the economy. Too much might create a problem with the prices. Let's now have a look at the fourth macroeconomic policy objective, and that is to do with the balance of payments. So balance of payments is to do with the difference between money inflows and outflows, how much money is coming in and coming out of the country. So why would money be going in and out of the country? It's because we trade in goods. So for example, a country could export its goods, and if the goods are going abroad, the money inflow will come back into the country, as a payment for those goods. The opposite will be happening if we are importing. When we're importing, goods are coming into the country, and therefore money as a payment for those goods will be going out of the country. It will be the outflow. There could also be cross-border payments. For example, if you have friends or family abroad, you might support them by transferring cash to them, or a government of the country could help another nation by giving them funding for healthcare, educational, or other programs. But let's now think about what we want to achieve in this balance of payments. The macroeconomic policy objective says we want a balanced balance of payments, as in we want our inflows to be equal to our outflows. Why is that? It's because if the money inflows are not quite equal, it could cause problems with the currency. So if we have a deficit, and that means, we have too much outflow, the money is leaving the country, that shows to us that, for example, companies or individuals no longer believe that this country is a good place for investment, and therefore the currency of this country will suffer, it will depreciate, it will become weaker in relationship to international currencies, and therefore that country might struggle to purchase the goods from abroad. Its currency is no longer worth as much compared to others. But we also don't want a surplus, too much money coming in, so too much inflow, because if everybody wants to invest into the country, if there is a lot of money coming in, that means that could lead to inflation. Everybody wants to buy goods made in a particular country. The prices of those goods could go up, and that could make them less affordable to the local population. We also need to understand the overall effect of the international trade on the world as a whole. And if one country has a surplus, too much money is going into one country, another will have a deficit, too much money is going out of that country, because overall, if we look at the world's economy, all of our inflows will equal our outflows. So the countries that have a balance of payment deficit will complain that there is not enough investment in those countries, that they're suffering as a result of surplus that is generated by some other states. And now let's drill into further details. So we talked about the importance of economic growth. Let's now look at what are the components of the growth. Based on our discussion, we said that when we look at the economy, we will need to look at what's happening inside the country, as well as how international trade could influence our economy. So generally, when we measure the size of the economy, we use aggregate demand as the measure of the economy. And often you might hear the term GDP, gross domestic product, that is a measure of the size of the economy, that is the measure of aggregate demand, the volume of goods and the value of goods that are being demanded and produced. So our GDP is influenced by what's happening in the domestic economy. And there are three parties in the domestic economy we need to consider. Consumer spending, me and you going to the shops, buying things. That means that the shop could then reinvest the profits that they have made into opening new branches. So that is investment by firms. And of course, do remember there is a role for the government. Government will tax individuals on their earnings. Government will tax companies on their profits, and then will spend the money on transport, on education, on healthcare. Let's also have a look at the impact of the international trade on our economy. And with international trade, we need to consider exports and imports. We said exports are the goods made in the domestic economy that are sold abroad, but the money for those exports will come into our economy and will contribute towards our growth. Whereas imports are the opposite. Imports are the goods made in a foreign country for which we have to pay, so the money will go out of our country to that foreign state, and that will reduce the size of our economy. But our economy size isn't always stable. We started our discussion today by saying there are fluctuations in the size of our economy. And that is what economic cycle is introducing us to. So in the economic cycle, we think about how output of the economy, or GDP, that we've just mentioned, changes over time. And though the overall trend, this dotted line you can see, is that economy will grow over time, but it does not grow in a straight line. We go through peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs. So peak is the time when economy is working at its hardest, when there are lots of employment opportunities, could sometimes lead to inflation. But when those prices get too high, consumers might step back and go, don't want to buy, I think it's too expensive. Or companies with those expensive resources are not able to make a profit anymore. So they will go, let's not do it. Let's not spend, let's not invest. And that could lead to a recession, decline in our economy, until it bottoms out in a trough. Our economy's resources will become much cheaper, much more accessible. Labor prices will fall, as in at the time of difficulties in the economy, people might be willing to accept lower wages. Inflation is low because people have no money to spend. So with those cheap resources, somebody with a bit of entrepreneurship, a little bit of commercial spirit will go, you know what, with those cheap resources, I can make a good, viable product service, and therefore new industries, new types of products could emerge. And if those are popular, then the economy starts to grow and recover until we reach another peak. So there are natural fluctuations in our economy, up and down, and overall, over the long term, our economy is going to grow. Those peaks and troughs could be hard to handle. Nobody wants to live at the time of a severe economic downturn. So we need to make it a little bit easier for the population to handle those peaks and troughs. And that's where government steps in. Government has two key tools in its arsenal to help handle those fluctuations in the economy: the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So the fiscal policy is to do with the income and expenditure of the government. Remember, government receives income from taxation. They tax individuals on your income. For example, the taxes from your salary. They tax companies on their profits. And then they will spend this money on schools, hospitals, and public transport. But relationship between income and expenditure of the government isn't always straightforward. Government doesn't always spend every penny it receives in taxes, and the relationship between income and expenditure could be used as a way to boost or to shrink our economy, whatever is required at the time. So let's start with the first one, budget deficit. So budget deficit means that the government is spending more on the schools and hospitals and transport that it receives in income. So our expenditure is greater than our income. Why would government want to spend more than it receives? And if we flick back to something we've seen in the previous slide, remember that in a domestic economy, there are three participants that we need to know about: the individual consumers, investment by firms, and the government. So if consumers are not willing to spend, if companies are worried about investment, government could step in and spend more at this difficult time and therefore prop up the economy. So often budget deficit is used at the time of economic downturn, when consumer spending falls, when investment by firm falls, and therefore it's referred to as expansionary policy. It helps economy to expand when things are a little bit tough. Government could also do the opposite. They could run a budget surplus. So when we think about the relationship between the income and expenditure, if our income is greater than expenditure, that means government receives more in taxes than it spends on schools, hospitals, public transport. Why would government want to do this? Government is putting money aside rather than spending it all. Government is creating a budget surplus because a wise government would know that the economy does fluctuate over time. There could be good days or good years in the economy, and there could be tough ones. So if we put money aside in the good years, that will make tough years a little bit more easier. But by putting money aside in those good years when the economy is growing strongly, government is contracting the economy. The government is not allowing for the rapid pace of economic growth that otherwise would be possible. So that is the fiscal policy of the government. Let's also have a look at the monetary policy. So with the monetary policy, government regulates the supply of money in the economy. And that is done using a variety of tools. So setting interest rates, for example, when the central bank of a country sets interest rates at a low level, that means your rates on the credit cards, your rates on loans, your rates on mortgages are likely to be low. Banks respond to the fact that cash is available to them at a low interest rate from the central bank, and are likely to pass on those cheaper costs of funding to consumers, to businesses. As a result, you can obtain your loans and mortgages at a lower interest. And of course, if you have to pay less interest, you'll be willing to spend more, you'll have more cash available. So low interest rates are going to be seen as an expansionary policy. It will be easier for companies to borrow and invest. It will be easier for the consumers to borrow and purchase, and the economy will grow. The opposite, what about the central bank setting very high interest rates? That will result in a contraction of the economy, as fewer consumers will be able to afford that loan, as fewer companies will be able to make repayments on their borrowings. Another tool a government could use is selling their own bonds. And bonds are securities, like promise papers of the government, saying, if you give me cash, I will repay you that cash with a little bit of interest on top. Just bear in mind that the interest on governmental bonds is normally very low, but those are often seen as desirable investments because they're very secure. Government has very low chance of defaulting on its bonds. So let's now think about the impact of selling bonds on the availability of money. So when the government sells bonds, that means that banks or other investors are getting that bond paper and handing over cash to the government. And that means that those banks or other investors have less cash to invest in something else. And therefore, from perspective of money available to firms to invest, that will be reduced. Alternatively, what if government one day decides to buy back those bonds? So they take the papers back and give cash to the banks, to the investors, and therefore those banks and investors can now invest more in other undertakings. So by government selling and buying bonds, they could impact on the amount of cash available for investment in private entities, and therefore the growth in the economy. Finally, we could look at the interaction between the government and the banks by looking at how the reserve requirements are set. So we want to make sure that our banking system is safe. We've learned from previous crises that banks need to park some cash aside to have it for a rainy day. What if there is a bit of uncertainty in the market? So a central bank of a country under the watchful eye of its government will decide what is the appropriate amount of reserve, appropriate amount of money that banks need to set aside and not use for further lending. So let's now think about what that does to the amount of money available in the economy. If every bank, Barclays, HSBC, nationwide, has to set money aside and not use it for lending, that means there will be less money available for you as an individual because it's going to be harder for you to get that credit card you want. It will be more difficult for businesses to get a loan because banks don't have cash to lend. And that means you as an individual consumer, you don't spend, companies don't invest, and therefore economy starts to contract. Of course, government could do the opposite. They could set very low reserve requirements, as in the banks could lend as much as they like. They don't need to have the safety cushion of cash. And that means banks are encouraged to give out more money for the consumers to spend on credit cards. They will be encouraged to give out more loans to companies, and therefore there will be more investment resulting in the expansion of that economy. So I hope you have enjoyed that little introduction to the macroeconomics. And hopefully we might also see each other again in either physical or an online class where we will be able to expand this further. Lots of luck in your exam, guys.